So yes, as Jordan said, this is part of kind of work in progress research that's I'm about a year in. So um, this is aimed at looking at kind of development of visual characteristics in Phoenician, and particularly handwritten writing, ink writing, what's often called cursive. And I am very jealous of the talk we just saw with all this huge, wonderful Egyptian hieratic, because the trouble with studying ink writing in Phoenician, even though the chances are this accounted for the vast majority of what they wrote, is that we have very, very little of it. So for the period I'm interested in, the kind of the early first millennium BCE, we don't have huge quantities of Phoenician writing in general. But the amount of actual ink writing is even smaller. So from the kind of core Phoenician area, Lebanon, we have one example, this jar inscription from a tomb in Tamburit. I should say, I apologise for my pronunciation of any place names and things because I don't hear these said out loud. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. So we just have this one, as far as I know, an ink inscription on a jar. We can slightly bolster that by looking outside of just kind of Lebanon and looking into kind of Israel, Palestine, Sinai Peninsula. So we have these really interesting plaster wall inscriptions from Kuntilet Adrud in Sinai Peninsula. We also have some wall inscriptions and kind of vessel inscriptions from Deir Allah in Jordan, and these are very kind of important sources for what ink writing looked like at the beginning of the first millennium. But what we're used to seeing in Phoenician is this sort of thing, lapidary inscriptions. So this is the Nora Stele, the very famous Phoenician inscription from Sardinia. And on the right there, we saw this yesterday. This is the Kilamua or Kulamua Stele from Zinjali in Turkey. And this tells you something, again, about the state of the Phoenician corpus from the beginning of the first millennium. That a lot of it is not actually from the core Phoenician homeland. It's from either the kind of westward diaspora into the Mediterranean, the trading. Well, we don't know exactly what this is and why it was there, but the expansion westwards, or it's other societies like Samal that we were hearing about yesterday, taking up the Phoenician alphabet, using it in their own ways. So again, it's very complicated to try and get at the idea of what the ink everyday writing looked like from this. People certainly do try it. They try to pick out particular paleographic features in the script that they think are coming from the ink handwriting, and then reconstruct kind of the development of cursive, if you like. But it's complicated, and it's difficult, and it's very indirect. Now, I just used the word cursive, and I'm mostly trying to avoid that because I don't like it very much. And that gets us onto one of the themes of this talk, which is the difficulties of using kind of etic terms versus emic terms for categorizing different types of scripts and different appearances of script. So this is a nice example. When we talk about cursive and we contrast that with lapidary or monumental writing, that seems to me that's very much kind of drawn out of Western European writing traditions, that we have this, like Emily was talking about yesterday, we have this very kind of set Latin, Roman tradition of monumental writing that is very different in Roman writing from the cursive, from the everyday. And that kind of informs the way European writing developed, not just in the Roman period, but through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. As we start talking about writing in our own kind of cultural tradition, how we conceptualize it, how we think about it, that's informed it. We have this very strong division between cursive and monumental. And that there's a strong tendency when Europeans, Americans, people in that Western tradition talk about other writing traditions, that they try and impose those categories. So if you read books on Arabic calligraphy or Arabic writing, it's very common to see people say, oh, there is no kind of non-cursive version of Arabic, like everything is joined up, everything is flowing, it's all cursive. But then you also see a lot of people say, well, this variety of Arabic is cursive and this one is not, or or this is a more cursive variety, or this one comes in at this point and is a cursive version of that one. And it kind of breaks down, like, what do you mean by cursive in that sense? Like, I don't want to label this point, except to say that Arabic is not short of terms to describe different varieties of its scripts. They have, huge numbers of these and very precise terms for things. Like, these are just two, but I hope even if I can't read Arabic, I've tried, but you can see very clearly, yes, these might both conform to what we think of as cursive, but they're very different. And that's Kufic, and that, I can't remember, something like that, but I apologise, I'm not an Arabic specialist. So when we come to the ancient world, like I've already said, we have basically nothing to work from. Is it even remotely plausible that we can try and get beyond using these ETIC categories and start thinking about, well, how do people in the ancient world think about different types of writing, different appearances of writing? And obviously that's going to be very difficult and it's going to be very partial, but one way I hope we can start to kind of move in that direction is by looking at sites like Byblos. Byblos is a really important Phoenician site for a huge number of reasons. It's particularly in this early period, the end of the Bronze Age, the beginning of the Iron Age, it is unusually prominent in textual sources, so things like the Amarna letters, the Egyptian report of Wenamun, which is probably a fictional account of kind of early Iron Age Levant. It's about an envoy going to Byblos to procure cedar wood. But from our perspective, the reason why Byblos is particularly useful is that we have two different scripts from the site. So on the right here, this, you probably can't see this very well, but there's a Phoenician alphabetic inscription across the lid of this sarcophagus, and there's another one on the side of it, just here. I'll show you a better kind of an illustration later on, you should be able to see it more clearly. But we also have this other script, which is called, usually these days it's known as the Byblos script, but you'll also see it referred to as Biblian pseudo-hieroglyphic, or sometimes the Byblos syllabary. This is a very small corpus of material. It's only 14 or 15 inscriptions, depending on how you count it. But obviously, because it's such a small corpus, it's undeciphered. That hasn't stopped there being a number of often very eccentric attempts to decipher it over the years. But really, with a corpus this small, decipherment is not on the cards. So what this does allow us to do, I hope, is to begin to compare the kind of the visualities, the fields of use of these two scripts at a single site. And that can perhaps begin to help us think about the different ways that people at Byblos think about scripts, the different ways they can use them, and see whether there is a sort of a categorical difference here. Now, obviously that works best if these scripts are contemporary. And this brings us to the next problem. Excavation at Byblos was done in the 1920s, and the state of dating at Byblos is kind of summarised by this picture, which is a minecart that's gone off the rails. It was very extensively excavated. There was a huge range of kind of chronological periods at the site, from Crusader castles to Ottoman houses to Middle Bronze Age temples, Roman colonnades. There is everything at Byblos. It's a wonderful, beautiful site, and you should go there if you get a chance. But the chronological and stratigraphic recording and things were not well carried out, even by the standards of the 1920s. There is basically nothing from the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. There's the Royal Cemetery, which is dated to most of the tombs of Middle Bronze Age, but as we'll see, there are a couple which might be late Bronze, early Iron Age, and that is it. They found nothing from the late Bronze Age or the Iron Age, and we know, as I just said, the site is active and important in that period. So where is it? Did they mislabel it? Did they just not notice it? Was it on a slightly different part of the site and eroded into the sea? We don't know. And what this means is that we have no archaeological dating whatsoever for the Byblos script. It's all surface finds, secondary contexts, or where it was apparently found in proper archaeological contexts, the observations of the original excavators are implausible or extremely ambiguous. So you get nothing. The alphabetic inscriptions, Byblos has a series of what's called the Royal Biblian Royal inscriptions. They're probably the earliest significant kind of corpus of alphabetic Phoenician inscriptions. Before that, you only really get kind of small bronze inscribed arrowheads that just have names on. This, we have actual sentences, inscriptions. Again, the dating for that is really difficult. So this is probably the most famous. This is the tomb of a man called Ahiram. It was dedicated by his son Itabal or Pelushabal, depending on which reading you take, who is the king of Byblos. And this was the only alphabetic inscription that was found in anything approaching an archaeological context. This was found in one of the royal tombs. The trouble is that the tomb had been looted in antiquity. So we have what could ostensibly be dating material, like these Egyptian alabaster vessels with the cartouche of Ramesses II. But we don't know whether these were part of the original grave goods, whether they were dropped by the looters, whether they fell in from later on. So there is a kind of ongoing disagreement as to whether this is a Bronze Age tomb, whether it's a Bronze Age sarcophagus that had an alphabetic inscription added later, or whether it's an Iron Age sarcophagus and it was all added at the same time. The reason people would like it to be Iron Age is that these are our two otherwise datable Biblian royal inscriptions. So these are again, these are Egyptian royal statues. We have Asorkon I as a bust, and this is a statue based of Sheshonq I, who are both sort of 10th century, early 9th century kings. And these were inscribed at Byblos by two sons of Yehimilk, Abibal and Elibal, who seem to have succeeded one another as kings. So we have a terminus postquem for these, which is that they are sort of 10th century, beginning of the 9th century. Obviously, there's nothing to stop these inscriptions having been added later, but generally people think that's around the right date. And paleographically, for what it's worth, that inscription looks quite similar. So, all of that is a preamble to say, despite these dating problems, there are a certain number of slight indications that we should perhaps consider these scripts as close or overlapping in terms of date. So these have been discussed by scholars like Benjamin Sass. And I'm going to say at the outset, these are not a smoking gun, okay? You can argue with any of these. They're just indicative of at least a kind of relationship between the scripts, a dialogue, if you like, but they're not conclusive. So the first thing is that they have shared document types. We have these bronze spatulas, which are a very characteristic type of documents in the Byblos script. It's about 4 or 5 out of a corpus of 14 or 15. So small numbers, but a significant proportion. We also have one that's inscribed in the alphabetic script. What is interesting is this might also be a palimpsest. So these marks on the back have been interpreted as Byblos script. And some people also think they can see signs of it underneath the alphabetic inscription. But it is quite abraded, so take that with a pinch of salt. So shared document types and unusual document types. We also have layout parallels. So these are, again, Byblos script inscriptions. You can see a kind of, this line ruling is very characteristic. This one runs top to bottom, but it's unusual in that mostly they run right to left. And again, this is alphabetic. This is a stele of King Yehimilk, who is the father of the two kings I mentioned a minute ago. And this one again seems to be a palimpsest. So again, that's one point of relationship between them. This line ruling may belong to the original Byblos script inscription, but it's been respected by the later alphabetic one. But they haven't bothered to continue these lines all the way across. So there is a degree of interaction there, a degree of relationship, a degree of dialogue, but it's only a degree. But there are other, people have seen other examples of what they think might be palimpsests, but they're more controversial. So, like I said, it's not conclusive, it's not a smoking gun, but there is, I would say, at the very least, a dialogue between the alphabetic script and the Byblos script, which may indicate that they were at least proximate in date. The general dating for the Byblos script, I should say, people usually put it sort of between the Middle and Late Bronze Age. My own view is that it's probably something around that date, maybe in use for quite a long time, and at the tail end of it might more or less coincide, if not exactly, or at least not too far off the rise of the alphabetic script. So, all of that is a preamble to say that I think it's justified to at least try to compare the visual scopes of these two scripts. The way people generally talk about the Byblos script is, when they're not trying to do mad decipherments, it's to talk about it in terms of its relationship with Egyptian. I mentioned that it was originally known as pseudo-hieroglyphic. Although that name is no longer particularly fashionable, people still very much focus on it as a kind of index of relationships with Egypt. Byblos was very closely linked with Egypt in terms of culture and kind of religion and things like that. And as a kind of evidence of similar thought patterns within the Views project, here you'll have seen Jordan shared this extract from Houston and Stauder yesterday. I'm going to share the same one, except I'm going to highlight slightly different passages. This is their definition of a hieroglyph, and they contrast it with linear writing, which is a very typical thing that people do when they're talking about the Byblos script and the alphabet. One of them is linear, one of them is alphabetic. Sorry, one of them is hieroglyphic, or at least Egyptian influenced. That's probably more appropriate to say. So, what is a hieroglyph? This is the first thing I want to focus on. People are very, very fixated on the Byblos script as something very Egyptian looking. But how Egyptian is it? Does it work visually in the same way that Egyptian writing tends to? Well, there are three things that Houston and Stauder pick out. One is that hieroglyphs are characterized by pictorial signs and a commitment to depicting things. Second is that they're thoroughly integrated with aesthetic culture. And the third is this ontological aspect, which Jordan talked about a great deal yesterday, so I don't need to labour that point. This sense that hieroglyphs are not just a representation, but they're a thing in their own right, which performs in a particular way. So, how do these fit the Byblos script? Well, this is the table of Maurice Dunant, who published them in the 1940s originally. And you can see, well, you maybe can't see because it's quite small, but he's organised the signs according to what he thinks they represent. Some of these are quite convincing. Obviously, if you look down the first column at the animals, I don't think anyone's going to quibble about the birds or the snakes, even the insects. But I think it's fair to say that they get a bit more abstract and geometric as they go across. And I worry that picking out these kind of identifications of what the signs represent when you can't even read them is a little bit of a Rorschach test where you can see what you want to see. So, yes, some of them might have pictorial or iconic aspects, but I want to be careful about talking about the degree of commitment to representing things, because even if you look at our own alphabet, if somebody tells you that, you know, what the iconic origin of a particular sign is, you can see it. Like, if someone tells you that M comes from the water sign, it's not difficult to see how it's a water sign, but you don't necessarily make that connection unless someone points it out to you. The ontological argument, I think you just have to put that to one side. We have no idea whatsoever what these things say, so it's premature to even begin trying to think about the ontology of them. But the capacity for performance, the kind of playful ways in which you can use hieroglyphs, we can say a little bit about. So here is an example of the kind of thing that I think they mean by this, the capacity for performance. This is a statue of Ramses II as a child, which can also be read hieroglyphically as his name. And then we saw these yesterday as well, these army signs in Luwian hieroglyphs, where the depiction of the king also functions hieroglyphically. We don't have anything like this as far as we can tell in the Byblos script. It's just sign after sign after sign after sign. It looks very much like standard sequential text. We don't even have the kind of arrangement of signs in aesthetically complex ways, or even moderately complex. They're not that complex. So in Egyptian, we have the idea of the quadrat, where you can arrange your signs in a particularly kind of balanced or pleasing way within the line. In Luwian hieroglyphs, you arrange things in columns within the horizontal line. Even in Cretan hieroglyphs, you tend to arrange your signs in a way to fill the space, not leave empty lacunas. It's not just a kind of one after another. It's, you can fill them together to fill the space in a more two-dimensional way, if you like. This is almost every Byblos script inscription. There's like two missing, I think, but that's enough to give you an idea of both the way it tends to be laid out, but also this final question of the integration with wider aesthetic culture. Now, we can't rule out that these things would have been, say, on statue bases or juxtaposed with other material that we don't have. But as we currently have it, as the corpus currently stands, there is no interaction with anything else. It's just sign after sign after sign after sign. And I want to compare this with something else. This is a linear B tablet from the Aegean. I picked this because linear is in the name. And this is a pretty typical tablet. It's a famous one, but it's not unusual. So it's syllabic signs, but it also has these ideograms, which kind of replicate what you have spelt out syllabically, reinforcing it. But these function as drawings. So these are tripods or vessels, and the characteristics of these signs reflects what we're told about them in the syllabic text. The number of handles, the number of legs, that sort of thing. We have lots of these signs still quite iconic. Things like, you get them looking like writer, vessels, or trees, things like that. You also have changes in the size of the script, nothing particularly mind-blowing, but you can see here at the end they run out of space and they go superscript. And in other linear B tablets, you get changes of scale for like headings and things. So we're not dealing with anything, massively earth-shattering, but it's more than we seem to have in the Byblos script, where everything is pretty consistent in size. There's no signs that look like they're illustrations or anything. It's just a wall of text. So if this is linear and that is pseudo-hieroglyphic, I don't know. What can these terms even mean? And just to complicate things even further, we have this inscription from Byblos. This is called by Dunon linear pseudo-hieroglyphic. We don't know what this is. It looks a bit like the Byblos script. It also looks a little bit in places like the alphabetic script, and again might be a palimpsest with this other script, the Byblos script signs here underneath. I'm not even going to attempt to explain what this is. I don't know. Okay, what about the alphabet? Well, I've already shown you all of these. I hope even a cursory glance at them will show you that something slightly different is going on with alphabetic inscriptions. Each of these in various ways is interacting with other kinds of visual material and indeed other kinds of writing. If we look at this one, the inscription starts here and runs round and goes up onto his other shoulder. Now that can look very odd and slapdash to our modern sensibilities, but let's try and put that aside and say actually what this is showing is a very flexible use of the script, where it can bend, it can mold itself to the shape of the object in ways that you just don't get in the Byblos script, which is very kind of rectilinear, laid out. They have line rulings, it's orthographic. They're also deliberately avoiding the Egyptian cartouche because that's important. On this one, the Phoenician inscription runs up and down, but it's not kind of signs out the right way up, if you like on that vertical Byblos script inscription. The whole thing is rotated. to fit next to the cartouche. And I already mentioned how this one is different in that it goes over the top of the earlier Byblos script inscription. It doesn't avoid it, but it does respect the line rules. And then the Ahiram sarcophagus again, who knows what this is, but very much here we have a juxtaposition of alphabetic inscription with pictorial programs, whether or not that's executed as a single decorative scheme or whether it's added to it later. And this is borne out elsewhere in Levant as well when we look at early alphabetic inscriptions. This is a ewer from Lachish in Israel-Palestine, and you have an early alphabetic or proto-Canaanite, if you like, inscription running across here, juxtaposed with images. These are the wall plaster inscriptions from Kuntil Adrud again. You can't really see very clearly, but there are alphabetic signs here and here, and then the image of the human head in between. And there are others with better alphabetic textual preservation, but this one is one that has pictures as well. And then these pithoi as well from the same sites where you have doodles and alphabetic writing. Der Allah. Now, I hope this looks vaguely familiar from the previous talk. This is a literary text, probably the first substantial literary text in the linear alphabet. And this has been talked about as a kind of book put up on a wall. It's thought to represent like the layout of scrolls. So you have red framework, you have the use of red ink, similar to what we saw in the Egyptian examples, but you also have illustrations outside the frame. And I'm sorry, this picture isn't particularly great. People generally photograph text and not the illustrations, but that's the best one I could find. And again, we saw these yesterday, so I'm not going to belabor the point on these. These are obviously not Phoenician. They are from another society which is using the alphabet, but again, it seems to be seen as appropriate for using in a way that integrates with other kinds of visual material. So, not really conclusions, because I don't think there's enough material here to have any kind of firm conclusions, but observations. I do think that the Byblos script and the Phoenician alphabet seem to have very different scopes of use and different ways of interacting with visual material, which I think is a reasonable way of suggesting that maybe the people at Byblos thought of them as categorically different. Now, why that should be is a very difficult question, particularly because we have so little information about Byblos culturally at this time because of the lack of archaeological material. But I will try and answer it, just not today. By focusing on the way the Byblos script superficially borrows kind of sign appearance from Egyptian writing, I think people have underemphasized the ways in which it is fundamentally and profoundly not like Egyptian writing at all. It's something very different. The visuality of the alphabet at Byblos is consistent with what we see at other sites. So this sense that it's flexible, that it can be used alongside other visual material, that can be integrated into these wider programs. That's significant because it suggests that the comparisons I'm making at Byblos maybe have wider applicability, even though, again, caveats with dealing with extremely small corpora. And finally, linear and hieroglyphic are not necessarily helpful terms in thinking about the relationship between these scripts. Again, this reinforces the thing I said at the beginning about etic versus enic terms and trying to approach scripts on their own terms visually rather than imposing our own categorizations on them. So I'd say that when we come to scripts with these kind of preconceived notions of what the categories are and what we want to make things fit into, we potentially risk missing other kinds of relationships with other visual material and other sort of visualities. Thank you very much.